Here we are in Ways and Means. It is Tuesday, February 17th at 2:30. We are talking about school district debt. I've asked John to put together some language that we're going to walk through. It is like an idea of an idea that John put words to. The word draft is not drafty enough for what this is. It's just a conversation starter about a way we can structure a solution, but it is not the solution. And there's sort of two different pieces of this conversation. There's a conversation about what do we do with existing school district debt when we move to a foundation formula. And then there's a separate but related conversation about what does future school construction debt look like and how is that structured and supported by the education fund. In an ideal world, that could be one seamless system. And that's what this language from John does. I don't know if it will work or not, and there's still no revenue source attached to it. And then we have Michael here from the bond bank who took us through a presentation a couple weeks ago that we might need a little bit of a refresher on. Michael, thank you for your patience with us. To think about sort of how existing school district debt is structured. And so I think we're going to start with John, though it might have made more sense to start with Mike. What's your timing? Okay, John.
I think wait.
Okay, cool. Michael, can you start us by taking us through sort of what the current state of school district debt is?
Yeah, sure.
Hello, and thank you.
Great. Michael Gaughan, Executive Director of the Vermont Bond Bank. Nice to see everyone again. So I will share my screen, and this will be a little bit repetitive for you all, but sounds like that's kind of the idea. So
that is very much the idea. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, you don't live it every day like I do. So okay. So yeah, just a quick reminder, the orange numbers here are those that are adjusted for inflation, and the blue numbers or bars are the nominal amount of borrowing. So you see kind of a huge spike in the 70s, some action in the late 90s, and then more recently as we deal with the huge backlog in deferred maintenance. This translates into this debt service. This shows debt service per year. All bond bank borrowers as well as Winooski and Burlington combined, with the caveat that to the extent a school district might have debt with a bank or something like that, that's not something that we have data on. But for the most part, I think this represents the full picture of things. There's the 2026 payment is a little bit misleading, as Burlington has some Great Recession era bonds that have a payment associated with them for which they have a sinking fund. So the 2027 number is really a more normalized number in terms of the amount of the ed fund that's going to pay debt service. Kind of bottom line is it's just under $50 million per year. And then the sort of light blue line are Chittenden County schools. And then Franklin is also notable in there in green as well. So you see kind of after 2043 is really when we more or less retire outstanding district debt, except for some residual Chittenden, which I think is really just Winooski. The Burlington bond pays off pretty quickly. I think that was a 20-year amortization, a 20-year bond that they issued for the majority of the school construction need there. Same numbers, but same depiction, but the actual numbers per county. So it gives you just a sense of scale here. Little chance to pat ourselves on the back, but also talk about the future. The weighted average cost of capital in the bond bank's portfolio is 3.74%. And so that is quite favorable. And, I don't know that we'll be able to achieve the same efficiency, the same low rates going forward. So it's something to note as we contemplate, several $billion worth of new construction borrowing. I included this slide. This had not been in your previous presentation, but I thought it worth highlighting. Every year, the bond bank takes every borrower that we have in our loan portfolio and reviews their financial statements, puts those numbers into a database and produces medians. And this is the way that the rating agencies look at financial benchmarks as well. So just as a comparison, in our portfolio, in the bond bank's portfolio, sort of the state overall, the median amount of debt service as a percent of revenue, which is how the rating agencies look at it, is 1.5%. That compares to 5.4% nationally, and for school districts between 1,000 and 5,000 students, 5.5%. So, I mean, this doesn't tell us anything we don't know about deferred maintenance, but I think it is an interesting benchmark as to what a healthy level of debt service might look like if you're keeping up with capital needs. I think you also are considering in the next few days, looking at reserves as well. And I just highlight that number's in here as well. We look at assigned and unassigned reserves, and those in the bond bank's portfolio are about 6% compared to between 10 and 28% nationally. Because of the strength of the ed fund, our real underwriting as it relates to school districts is sort of liquidity, and ability to manage expenses and pay debt service on a timely basis. So having some of that liquidity on hand is helpful in our analysis. So I just note that for your future considerations.
Michael, this chart shows that it's way under the median in terms of cash reserves as a percent of revenue, right?
Yeah, and there's school districts are quite diverse, as you all have learned nationally. Some have foundation formulas, some do not, some are fully tax supported. And so for those that are collecting taxes directly, you'd expect those to be a little bit higher to handle the ebbs and flows of tax receipts. But certainly included in those medians are districts that have debt that do have foundation formulas. I think the consequence I would just highlight is having some level of reserve, some unrestricted funds to obviate the need for cash flow borrowing and to ensure liquidity is helpful from our perspective. I don't know what the right number is necessarily, but it is helpful.
Thank you.
And do you have data on minimums and maximums or just minimums?
Yeah, we would have minimums and maximums, I believe, in the database. It's not something we publish, but if we did the little digging, we could probably figure that out.
Okay, that would be super helpful if you're able to.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, and so I think that so I'm a little bit guessing as to what the topics that you all want to discuss. I think that handles it, and then I have a comparison of outstanding debt per county to show how it's overweight or underweight school age population in that county. I don't know that's as relevant for this discussion. And then the amount of debt just by the vintage. So, newer debt generally being better because those assets have not depreciated as much as older debt.
One thing, I like the idea of the vintage of debt. The amount of the debt that is really very close to being finished, or the number of districts carrying debt that they are going to be finished with soon, was very striking to me when I looked at it earlier this year. And I think that's sort of hard to see in the totals, because we have a few districts who have taken on significant new debt.
Yeah, I think this chart helps a little bit.
Yeah.
So, like I said earlier, that 2042 number is quite significant for most counties. And in fact, Um, yeah, in fact, 2030 through 2032 is also kind of looks to be a bit of a break point, as you go from 38 to, 33 million.
Yeah.
But yeah. So
And I
24
understand it's
was,
sort of, it's hard to separate it out. It doesn't mean that that debt doesn't matter. It's sort of like two very separate trends to some degree.
right. I think that's right. I think that, yeah, certainly the newer debt is going to have a longer period in which it pays off, sort of by definition. So yeah.
And is most of the newer debt not through the bond bank?
It's no, I would say all of it except for Winooski and Burlington is through the bond bank.
Okay.
So for example, in Franklin County, BFA there went through the bond bank, and then Milton and Colchester have both gone through the bond bank as well. More recently, Hartford as well.
Thank you. Anyone?
So
Yes.
yeah.
Sorry, Representative Odie has a question.
I don't know, when to ask this, but, there have been places. A colleague said to me, there have been places that have been keeping up with their repairs. And, so going forward, how do we recognize that vis-a-vis places that will have to have a whole new school or do construct, like allow catch-up maintenance that they haven't been doing over time.
A question for me.
Now, I would say
Okay.
a question
Question for-
generally to consider. That's been brought to my attention, is that question.
Yeah, I think that's the question that we're to some degree reckoning with. How do we manage the existing district debt? And then how do we manage future debt for districts that have not been able to incur debt up until this point?
Yeah, and I was not even like building Holden High School. I meant places that over time, over the past how many decades, have been investing in their buildings. So they're not really in a position where they'll need to do an enormous investment. And yet, so they'll kind of have been doing the right thing and then
So I think the same way I was really trying very hard to set value judgments about what spending, like who is spending and why. I think similarly, the reasons a district might or might not have been able to invest in their existing infrastructure is a place. I'm not sure it's useful to value judgments about those decisions.
well, this person had that.
I know, but that person's not in this room, and so I'm
Well, I
gonna
wanna
speak
bring
to
it
you,
forward.
Representative Odie.
I'm just wanting
Yes.
to bring forward
Yes.
the concern.
No, I think it's a real concern about existing debt versus new debt. I just want to make sure that we're not blaming districts who, for whatever reason, weren't
No.
able to invest in their infrastructure.
No, it's either way.
Yeah.
Just how do we handle that? They may not have debt anymore. They may have been putting it into their yearly school bag. I don't know.
Yeah.
Ask.
If
Would you
there
like
are
to speak to
no,
that, Michael?
well, I didn't know if there were any questions on these slides. I did I realize it's a draft of a draft of a draft, but just
Yeah.
had two quick observations on the language. Were these slides helpful? Is there anything else to be
I think that's
reviewed?
it on the slides, and since the committee has not looked at the draft language yet, I wondered if you minded waiting
Oh, yeah,
around a minute for us to understand the language so we can have context for whatever you're about to say.
sounds good.
Is that okay?
Mhm.
Okay, feel free to do something else at your computer and ignore us. for a little
Very good.
you, Michael.
I'll listen attentively.
while. Thanks.
John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. My soapbox. Very bad way to start nonpartisan testimony. We'll screen share. Here we are. This is a draft. I think the chair set this up quite well, quite concept level that touches the award piece of the section of statute in Title 16 that deals with state aid for school construction. If it's helpful just to orient a little bit about the section that we're in, I'm happy to do that, but I'm also happy to just talk about this because I think the focus today is just on the award. So the basic thing that you should be aware is this doesn't otherwise disrupt the scheme for approval school construction projects that was enacted in Act 73. So the preliminary application, the final application, prioritization, all of those pieces continue to exist. And then this is a proposal, or this is language that addresses how that award is dealt with. Under Act 73, what you may recall is that there's proposed or enacted a debt service subsidy model, and it would grant to eligible school districts that have gotten approval for particular projects a debt service subsidy of between 20 and 40%, depending on if they meet certain bonus incentives. So all projects that met eligibility conditions were prioritized and received an annual appropriation for funding would have received a base amount of 20%. And if they met certain bonus incentives, they could get up to 40% in aid for eligible debt service costs. So just worth noting, eligible is a restriction on what those costs are. You could imagine someone pursuing a facility that might also have community benefits. For instance, maybe not all aspects of that project would be deemed eligible, but that's like the existing structure has been for years and years, even pre-moratorium. We had an eligibility condition. So that brings us to this particular section, which is just about the award piece. And this is replacing that 20 to 40% debt service subsidy model with a different piece. So what you see here, starting on line 3, this is your award of construction aid, a school district that receives final approval for construction aid. So that is, it's gone through the preliminary application process, and it's also received final approval. So it submitted a final application. That school district shall be eligible to receive construction aid of 100% of the eligible debt service cost of the approved project. And it's key that it says eligible to receive, because as we'll come down to in a little bit, this will be subject to an annual appropriation for these purposes. So it's not an outright entitlement. It's just that if you've made it through the approval process, you've been prioritized, would be eligible to receive this 100% eligible debt service cost coverage. And again, I just want to flag that word eligible, which I noted before, because there is a distinction against the next subsection. So that's how a school district that goes through the approval process would be dealt with.
Just a language question. When you read that, you added an additional eligible. You said eligible to receive construction aid of 100%. I think you said of the eligible debt service.
Mhm.
But here in the language, there's that second eligible isn't there.
Oh, I think you're in B, maybe.
Oh, okay, sorry, I was reading the wrong.
But you are pointing out the exact distinction that I wanted to draw out,
Okay.
which is that for school districts in the future, that's what you see under A, those that are going through the application process, it's 100% of eligible debt service costs. So that means there's an eligibility determination as to components, like we think about typically under the school construction program, certain components are eligible for coverage, certain are not. It's unrelated to if you can get kick in to the program, right? It's just about are components coverable. It's dealt with in rule. I would need to do a lot more digging to know what is actually eligible under existing rules that have been transferred to the agency. But yes, that's an important distinction, eligible versus just straight up debt service costs. So A is dealing with projects that go through the program in the future.
And I guess what I would say is big picture, the idea here is that districts have debt, that those debt payments are not included in the foundation formula as it's been conceived in any iteration. And so the debt payments need to be handled somewhere else. So that's sort of A. And then B is that essentially the same thing. The state cannot hold that debt as a state because of bond rating things and other things like that. And so the district would need to hold the debt, but the source of the payments for the debt would come as a categorical grant. And that's sort of the big picture framework that John's through. I'm sorry, I didn't lead with that. Representative Odie.
Thanks. You said prioritize a few times. And that it would be depending on what is appropriated each year. to help, do we envision a list? And then each of those things is funded 100% till it gets to money's out? Or is there gonna be a percentage?
I think that's a good question as to how it would be dealt with. In this case, this is specifying you've made it through the process, you get 100% debt service coverage. But as you might imagine, that could result in a kind of first in, right? Like once you've met a particular cap, how do you add more to that pool until the bonds have been dealt with? So I think you raise a good concern. Just to speak about the prioritization piece, you're not going to see that in this draft because that's elsewhere in the section itself, but we will come to the language about the cap in just a moment. So I think there's a policy question of here. How do you deal with the cap? What should a cap be? And how will prioritization work if you have a limited set of funds in each year and you're guaranteeing 100% coverage?
And the prioritization language is from like language that passed
Yep.
12 times already. It's the sort of branch structure that is sort of the new is here.
And it would be built out in rules, so we're, yep.
And as like, there are lots of different ways to do prioritization, like VHCB has sort of like a quarterly meeting where all projects come and are sort of approved. So just like by way of, there's lots of ways to do it with a cap that still is not first come, first serve. Representative Higley.
Could you tell me currently how it works if a town goes to bond for new addition or whatever? And they bond for it, let's say for 30 years. Is that bond amount the same for that 30 years? And is it in like a line item budget? Is it?
I believe so. So the way that it's currently dealt with is through your education spending. So it would be part of the budget that you submit to voters, and then you would have your annual amounts that you pay for your debt service over the course of those years. I guess one complexity to note is that there's the exclusion, right? You could imagine that resulting in relatively high per pupil spending figures, right? So it's worth noting that the excess spending threshold excludes capital bond payments that were voted prior to July 1, 2024. But currently it is dealt with through education spending, and those yearly payments would be part of your budget presumably. I think that is the answer to your
Okay, I
question.
think so. Thanks.
Member?
In a future state, if a district goes out and bonds and then money is not appropriated to fully make their debt service payment, how do they go about raising that extra funding? I mean, there's supplemental district spending, but is that going to be enough to cover if for some reason money is not appropriated? So I understand that we can't put the full faith and credit of the state on the line. I understood that from Michael's testimony last year, but we're sort of putting districts on the line with no mechanism for them to actually fulfill their responsibilities for the debt service.
And so what I hear you saying is sort of a problem that needs solving in this language is, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so please correct me, that what's happening?
Just making noise.
Oh, okay.
Just,
I was like, is that in my head? The language about appropriating could maybe be like changed to be more aligned with we have sort of formulaic language for other appropriations out of the education fund. And that language might be more appropriate than the language that John's included here.
I would
So
have
that's
to
sort of
look
a
at that for
guaranteed
future
expense.
state. Yeah, I would have to look at that for future state because it's one thing now where unfortunately there is the thing, but you basically just ask your taxpayers to pay more property tax.
Yeah.
Until you can meet the obligation. But if we're cutting that off and we're saying, you're getting your educational opportunity payments and everyone has similar tax rate, there's no mechanism there to make that money up.
And I'm saying the possible mechanism might be, say, the language that we use for the payments out of the extraordinary special education or something, like one of the formulaic payments that comes out straight from the education fund rather than from education spending.
I see what you're saying. Okay.
I see Michael's hand is up.
Yeah, Representative Burkhart hit on one of the points I wanted to mention in that under the existing, I have a couple comments on this, but one of the most material things is that, despite the ed fund, we maintain an unused but legally viable mechanism for the school debt to be a general obligation of that particular district in kind of a break glass situation. So I just highlight that as very important, and it's one of the reasons it's sort of kept off the balance sheet of the state, and is something to consider moving forward as well. So to your point, you know, even though the sort of the formula works that you'd be paying more, should there really be a shortfall, that district has the ability to levy a tax on its residents to pay the debt service.
Yeah, Representative.
Well, then, I'm understanding this, then the timing has to be such that the school district knows now whether it's going to have to go for supplemental district spending a year from now.
I think they would need to know for the entire life of the bond, actually.
The question, I think on Carlotti's point is when they're voting, will they know that it's an approved project to receive the construction aid?
And to be clear, you would not know that you had final approval until you had voted the bond itself. Some other complexities to note are is it kind of remains unresolved. You may recall from last year, what is supplemental district spending if things were shunted through that route, has a cap in place, right? But I don't think it was ever resolved what constitutes like, is school construction part of the thing that would count toward that? Is it its own special process? Just conversations that haven't happened yet. It could be, just that there are many unresolved things in this area.
The other strange part is that people won't be voting on the school budget and the foundation.
That's right.
But they'll be voting on whether or not to, or debt to buy and build a new school.
And so I just, like, as we're thinking through the problems, I really want us, when possible, to think about like that these are problems to solve, not just problems that are sitting there, right? So if we feel like that's a problem, then maybe districts should be voting on how their budget is spent, just not the amount that's raised, right? Or if we want to make sure that districts know that they'd be approved for this before they go to vote on the bond, then we should change the order of operations, right? Because this is like so far from like a finished proposal on the table. This is really
Yeah.
just like a, let's work through the problems and solve them.
And I don't know if it makes it any better, but that timing consideration of final approval requiring bond vote by the voters of the municipality is something that existed under the prior program too. So that's not unique to this structure, but it may still be a problem.
It seems like a bigger problem under the future structure.
You don't have the automatic mechanisms for it.
And then another question that sort of comes up for me, and Michael, I'd love for you to think about it as well, not answer now, but sort of separate from the supplemental district spending, is there, like, I don't understand bond law well enough to know if it's like what level of municipality is on the hook and what being on the hook for that means. I'd love to talk about that another time.
Would you like me to comment briefly on that?
Yeah, if you can, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think just an observation, and I don't know that I have it fully worked out, but having served on several of the committees, task force, whatever you want to call them, in construction aid, when we all looked at Rhode Island, and Rhode Island had developed this framework in which it's not being counted against the state's net tax supported debt. Those reimbursements amounts were, annually subject to budget and appropriation. So they weren't, a forward commitment of the state, and were amounts less than 100%. So I don't know from a policy perspective what the right answer is. There were, from Moody's, for example, there was a mental health hospital in which 100% of the reimbursements were coming from the state, and therefore the rating agency said, hey, this is we're going to count this as net tax supported debt, even though it wasn't even the state that was the issuer of the debt. And so I'm not really making a call on whether it's right or wrong, but I do say that is a risk of this framework where the reimbursement is 100% of the debt service. It may be a distinction that doesn't matter for the rating agencies, so it's something to consider. And then, I think just the two other quick observations are, on paragraph B, already we're seeing we're seeing less school construction spending in most cases than we have seen over before the moratorium. And so like whatever that date is, will have sort of a intentional or unintentional chilling effect unless it's accompanied by the aid on pursuing facilities projects. And then lastly, I think, and I speak for the uh I can never remember what we're called now, the advisory group, in that there's a material distinction between renovation and new construction, and that probably should go into the process as well, particularly if there's such a high level of involvement from the state.
Thanks. And the treasurer's office is sort of talking to the ratings agencies about this construct, and will come in afterwards. Yes, Representative Odie, and then I'm realizing that we have not let John finish his work here.
Construction different from renovation, different from also maintenance, or yeah, you didn't say maintenance, so you don't mean maintenance.
I'm sorry.
Michael, that was a question for you.
I couldn't quite hear it. I apologize.
Oh, sorry, I was hearing what you're saying, and you said that you have to acknowledge distinction between construction and renovation, and what about maintenance?
Oh yeah, I think that's certainly important. I guess, with the prior requirements for an ongoing facilities management plan, I think that hopefully helps with some of that. But I completely agree. There's some benchmarks out there as to what amount of budget should be contributed to either capital reserves or ongoing maintenance and operations. And that's certainly the last thing we want to do is not take care of these newer assets.
John, will you finish telling us about the language?
Let's do it. So we talked about 6A, which is for those school construction projects that in the future that are going through the state for school construction program. Let's talk about B. It's a very similar, but there is a slight difference. So you can think of this as a wiping the slate clean kind of approach. A school district, on line 9, subdivision B, a school district that has outstanding capital debt as of, this is an arbitrary date chosen, but December 31st, 2025, shall be eligible to receive construction aid of 100% of the debt service costs, so not just eligible debt service costs, of the debt service cost of the district's outstanding capital debt. That's meaning any outstanding capital debt for school districts within that bucket would be eligible to receive this full coverage of debt service costs for all of that outstanding capital debt. Subdivision C, that construction aid shall be awarded annually for annual debt service costs up to a maximum total annual amount of an unspecified figure, and is subject to an annual appropriation for the purposes of the program. Just to flag the policy considerations in this piece, this is an award on an annual basis for annual debt service costs. Alternatives are obviously upfront lump sum approaches to clean the slate, right? And I think some of that might be addressed as considerations in the advisory board's report from this past December. But the approach taken here in subdivision C is that it's an annual award for annual debt service cost, and it would be subjected to an unspecified cap. And like the Rhode Island model that Michael was speaking to, would be subject to an annual appropriation for purposes of the program.
So in that construct, just try to think this through. If the amount of construction costs, let's say it's 50 million a year, but they're capped at 35 million a year, then somewhere that 15 million has to be raised. So if it's not coming from the construction aid from the state, it has to come from the borrower, which in that sense is the school district that votes it in. Am I missing something? That's really.
I think that's one way to think about I think that's a fair way to think about the problem. There's different ways you might think about the secretary trying to comply with these sections, because we're just seeing the award section here, right?
Yeah.
But an application will need to we put aside the existing debt, which will be its own set of problems, right? You would need to set a cap reflective of what it takes to account for that, if you want to cover all of those at 100%. We're putting that aside for projects that come through the application process for the state aid program. You might ask the question whether it affects the prioritization mechanism with an awareness of a cap, right? Like, would you be prioritized? So we don't know yet what the priority rules would be. But you can imagine that if you have a cap in place, limited funds available, and you're trying to set which projects should be in that annual legislative request for appropriation for school construction purposes, that might be something someone thinks about, particularly if you're taking seriously the 100% coverage. So I think there's tensions here is what you're identifying, and there's lots to be resolved. But this is the basic idea, 100% coverage for clean slate for those that have existing debt as of a particular date, December 31st, 2025, and then 100% debt service coverage of eligible debt service costs for those projects that meet all the eligibility conditions, go through the state aid program and receive approval. Annual awards up to an annual cap, subject to annual appropriation. And then I'm not going to go through D, that's from last year. Just to hit a couple of other things. Section 2, this is something you could or could not choose to include here, but we still have on the books in Title 16 a section that prohibits state aid for construction projects that are attributable to significant deferred maintenance. You might imagine that lots of school construction projects are of that form, including ones that are on the books having outstanding capital debt that you do want to clean the slate for. So just noting that this might be something you would repeal to make sure that those dollars can go to all those projects.
That's a negative. It's
A negative?
it's a negative, it's a double.
So the section 3454
Yeah.
is a prohibition on state aid for projects that have resulted from significant deferred maintenance. So if that remains in effect, there's all sorts of projects included in the buckets of things that you're trying to clean up that would not be eligible
So
to.
by repealing a prohibition, we are allowing this to
Exactly.
cover deferred maintenance.
Yeah,
Okay.
Affirmative.
yes, thank you.
Representative Maslin in the Brooklyn.
Yeah, so we've talked this afternoon about what you've got in proposed statute changes. And that there will likely be rules on how the funding is eligible, and I would imagine at least there would be a discussion of types of deferred maintenance, maybe or maybe not, or amount thereof, or how significant it is. I'm just putting that out.
So there's, yes, agreed, thank you. There's significant language in the law already about prioritization. And then we, the Agency of Education, we thought we're engaging in rulemaking and haven't engaged in rulemaking. We took some testimony about that last week.
Yeah.
2 weeks, whenever it was, yeah.
So anyway, that all makes sense. Thank you.
John, I have a quick question about what it means for a school district has outstanding capital debt as of December 31. So I would assume maybe even Burlington, maybe Burlington's a bad example, but some of the, Colchester, for example, has had a bond vote and has an amount they're going to draw down over time. My assumption is that they definitely didn't have all of that drawn down as of December 31st, 2025. And so do we need to have a few more words in here that describe things that were approved before then to make sure that all of that debt is actually wiped, well, not wiped, but clean slate, as you were saying. Same thing for things that are potentially being voted on town meeting day in just a couple of weeks that could potentially not be included in this, and they would be in sort of no man's land between, old projects and new projects, and maybe not even, who knows where they would be approved or prioritized in the new funding system. It sort of leaves them in limbo a little bit. So I just don't know if we need more words around that to just be clear about what we mean by outstanding capital debt as of December 31. Or whether the date needs to be different.
I think that is a policy choice. I think you're absolutely right that if the goal is to capture bonds that haven't issued but have been approved, you would want to be clear that that is the case, because a strict reading of outstanding capital debt would exclude those that have been voted but not yet issued. So I think it's a policy choice as to just what are all the kinds of things that you want to capture in this subdivision B.
And so for things like that, do you need us to be noting down these things? Is
Yeah.
somebody keeping a master list of decisions or things that we need to?
I would say for anyone that is, like, if you want to keep a list of the things that you're noticing and want to find fixes for, please do.
Okay.
Thank you.
Do you want to pull it back up?
Thank you, John.
Sure.
Thank you, it's pulling it down. The room shifted, didn't it?
I know. I thought that was perfectly.
One last thing, Madam Chair, this,
No, yes, I was gonna ask Michael if you want that as well.
this is still all contingent on other parts of Act 73 coming.
So technically, this piece, the effective date is July 1, 2026, which is the date that the program itself comes entirely online. So this is technically not contingent on those other pieces.
But we could make a contingent if we want more.
Yeah, infinite freedom. You guys are the decision makers.
Only other contingency is money. Where is the money coming from?
Yes. So if everyone could please think about all the things that have come up today, really try to do some problem solving around it. Michael, do you have anything that you want to add, though? I imagine you will also be thinking in problem solving.
Yeah, for sure. Love to problem solve. Unauthorized but unissued debt, I think, is the term of art for the prior conversation. Agree, it should be contingent to avoid further deferred maintenance and further deterioration of the assets we'll have to renovate. I suppose the last point would just be in this conversation, this is obviously very specific to the funding, but I just think that the new construction is so unique. It's worth really pulling apart a little bit. Our disadvantage could also potentially be our advantage. We have a couple $1 billion worth of potentially new construction. Individually, that's significant, but together, those are quite powerful and will attract a market. And Burlington, for example, I believe 40% of the labor force is from out of state. So we need significant mobilization, particularly on the new construction side. So as you centralize more functions in this analysis, I would just keep that in mind. Further centralize it, further centralizing the actual procurement, I think, alongside there's some language about design standards, but I really think centralized procurement, centralized risk management of cost overruns, things of this nature, could give some budgetary certainty in the process and really turn this disadvantage into an advantage for new construction specifically. Renovations won't lend itself as easily to kind of a large scale procurement effort, but new construction certainly would.
Thank you very much, Michael, and I'm sure we'll see you very soon to talk about this.
Sounds great. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right.
Charlie and Bridget, can you two be the leads for the steps on this? Thank you.
I guess one thing to flag is worth looking back if you're just trying to orient yourself at the task force report from 2024, which I want to rounding for this. That I think it was 2024 because the working group came out with legislative language that became what essentially passed in Act 73. Predecessor to that was the task force, and it has a big report with a lot of context on the debt service subsidy and those things.
Don't forget your thumbs.
Yes.
Okay, let us all reorient our brains for a brief moment. We are shifting to a bill that came to us from the Government Operations Committee, H 567. Yes, that wasn't a question, that was true. It's H 567. And there's also a technical-ish amendment that is also posted on our page. David, are you here to tell us about the whole bill? Is that your goal?
Prepared to do a rundown of the whole bill.
Okay, great.
Focus on.
Cameron, do you want to go first or second? Sorry, I didn't ask before.
No, it's okay, however.
Okay, if you could do big picture, David and Al?
Yes.
Hi, nice to see you. And there's a second chair that you could pull up. And so maybe we could do big picture with you two, and then Pam can take us through the language and then we can ask you all.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, David Chair, Deputy Treasurer, along with.
Albert LaPerle, Director of Unclaimed Property.
And we also have with us in reserve, Tim Duggan, our Director of Retirement, should there be questions specific to that area.
I can.
So I thought what might make sense, but I'm happy to defer to whatever is most useful to the committee, is do a very brief overview of each section and then circle back on one section in particular that I think is of interest to the particular interest of the committee regarding a shift in an unclaimed property transfer to the higher ed trust fund that would now come to the Vermont BT Saves. So if that makes sense, the committee will do a very quick overview and then circle back on that one piece and dive in a little bit more deeply, but we'll try to keep it concise. Al, can I turn over to you to do the
Sure, absolutely. So
sections?
I'd like to talk about unclaimed property. Thank you for having us over. I love to talk about unclaimed property. As you know, unclaimed property is a consumer protection bill. We take money in from businesses and it's our goal to return it to the rightful owner. The state gets a benefit from that, from being able to use these funds until we find the rightful owner. So we're making some small changes in unclaimed property. The first one, section 1, we're asking insurance companies that turn over payments for medical providers to give us an EOB number, an explanation of benefits number. That's going to help our medical providers identify what patients those payments are. Right now, if we get a huge payment from, say, Blue Cross Blue Shield, it's just a dollar amount. So when we give that to the medical provider, they don't know how to post that. But if we have the EOB numbers, that's going to assist the medical providers to post those to the right patients' accounts. So that's a small change, but a worthwhile change that helps get that money and pay those patients' accounts. Section 4, we're talking about returning money up to $1,000 without a claim for. Right now, we can return funds up to $250 without the individual filing claim form. And this will help the treasurers. I'm sure everybody's heard the treasurer's money back program, where we partner with the tax department. They match some of our data, give us updated addresses, and we return those funds without a claim form. This is going to allow us to return up to $1,000 versus Section 5, we're asking to raise the estate limit to $10,000. Right now, if we have property for a deceased owner that's in excess of $5,000, we make them open a small estate. And for many people, that is a task they don't want to do. So if we could raise that amount to $10,000, again, that's just going to help us return the property to people. Yeah.
So, thank you. So I'll jump in on section 6. Section 6 is a addition to our retirement statutes that would essentially, the overarching picture is to make sure that everybody who may be required to give employer contributions is subject to some enforcement language. As of right now, the Vermont State Employees Retirement System does not have this type of enforcement language within it. The other two systems do have, if not identical enforcement language. In one case, FEMA is identical. The other one is similar, but not exactly the same. And the idea being here that it will be a way for our administration to ensure that employers are paying in the required contributions. If this section weren't there, there is a chance that the only remedy remaining or potentially even required would be to remove the employee from the system, which feels like a very unfair outcome. And so this is sort of a administrative to avoid that potential outcome and make sure that every employer pays into the system is subject to the same language or similar language. Section 7 establishes a pension benefits and funding task force. This will review funding and amortization policies for the state and teachers retirement systems, as well as the retiree health benefits or other post-employee benefits. The idea here, the concept here being that as we get the plan under the current statutory scheme is to
pay down the unfunded liabilities up until 2038. And the concern being that as you get closer to 2038, there is increased potential volatility. And so if there were to be a significant market downturn, but you're still required to meet that full payment by 2038, you now face potentially a very large employer contribution that the legislature would be responsible for under current law. We want to gather the stakeholders to look at this issue and make sure that we don't end up in a situation where there may be significant financial pressure, and we want to make sure that these funds, the plan stays fully funded. We're not, and the sort of worst case scenario from the fund administration standpoint is that the necessary contributions aren't made in order to bring us to that full funding threshold. So we want to avoid that outcome. We're not prescribing any particular outcome here, which is why we want to pull the stakeholders together to work on it. Sections 8 through 20, I would say sections 8 through 20, this is the piece where we would transfer fiduciary oversight of the other post-employee benefit funds from the state treasurer's office to the Vermont Pension Investment Committee. Those funds used to be significantly smaller than they are now, but now that we've started pre-funding them and that pre-funding will save us significant money in the long term, those funds have grown dramatically. And so it makes more sense, instead of having a single fiduciary in the person of the treasurer, we would have this would be transferred to the Pension Investment Committee, which is a best practice to have a committee oversight of that. And I will say, there's a number of sections in 8 through 20 that are primarily administrative and just changing the statutory sections to meet up with the current VPIC being its own independent committee. So it's a bit of like cleanup, I would say, if that's an accurate summary. Sections 21 and 22 is a bit of a technical section, but it authorizes members of VSTRs and VEMRs to purchase service credit for time spent serving as president of an employee organization, such as the NEA. So they would still be able to get credit for time in which they may not have been in active employment. It would be neutral to the fund because they would be purchasing that after the fact, but it allows them to sort of catch up to where they would have been had they stayed in regular employment through that whole time. Section 23 is sort of technical pieces that the members of the CDAC committee would like to see in order to better describe their work. I will leave it there. I don't think it's a dramatic change. And section 24 authorizes the positions that our office is asking for. These are 2 unclaimed property positions. Al, do you want to briefly state the dramatic work increase?
Sure. So our office has been paying a tremendous amount of claims. In fiscal year 23, we paid 18,000 claims, 24, 19,000, and last year we paid 31,000 claims. So our claim numbers are skyrocketing. I give a lot of credit to Treasurer Pichek. He loves talking about unclaimed property.
Really
It
does.
drives our numbers, so which is good. And NAPA, the National Association of Unclaimed Property Administrators, has been working hard at giving national attention to unclaimed property versus just individual states. So it's really paying dividends in our office. However, you can see that we're getting, a tremendous suppression of paying claims.
And then the final piece in section 24, the retirement position. This would be for a new policy and research manager. Our retirement division runs very lean. We serve 2,860 members per staff member. The national median is only 1,300. So we're working very efficiently, I would say, but our division does do an enormous amount of work. A significant portion of what they do is customer service oriented work. So that increase in members that the per staffer really does have an impact. And I would also just note the division did extraordinary work this year with the transition, health insurance transition, that will save the state millions, I believe 20 million to the general fund, more to when you pull in the employee contribution. So it's a division that's working hard, very effectively saving money, but they do have a significant workload in comparison to peer divisions.
Are you seeing an increase in the number of retirees that you are working with?
Sam, can I throw that to the retirement division director?
May, yes.
The number of retirees goes a year, when you say working with, if you're talking about active engagement, with the way our health insurance is moving and spikes in rates that we're seeing to is driving additional fall volumes to the individual, and particularly this year where we're under transition. The actual people that were actively engaged with at all levels of the retirement division is substantially able to track raw numbers. So I can't present that to you, but anecdotal experience over the past 7 years.
So more retirees and higher call volume, and can you identify yourself for the record?
Tim Duncan, Director of Retirement Systems. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Okay. Yeah, Representative Bodie.
Another question about the retirees. I was thinking, when we figured out how we were going to pay down the big debt that we had, did we have projections that took into account fewer teachers because of fewer working teachers because of lessening number, the lower enrollment of students, and also did we figure in with, and do we need to figure in now, if we do consolidate, if there are fewer teaching positions of current teachers working? Was that figured in? Was all this figured in because you were demographics back then, or not?
I think that we had, so at the time of Act 114, the substantial pension, I think that's what you're referring to, or
Yes.
our most recent pension reform. The education transformation was not squarely on the table as it is today. So the, a dramatic reduction in headcount is not something that was sort of on the table at that time. Since that time, so every year so a couple things, every 3 years, we do experience studies. Those studies look at all of our assumptions, and they say, our expectations generally in line with what we've been seeing and what we think we will. So we'll change those, and that'll have an impact on when we pay contributions, upfront or after experience goes down. Then every year we do evaluations, and that's where we look based on our assumptions. Has our experience proven to be consistent? Has it proven to be different than any other? For example, this past year when we did our evaluation, we did have a reduction in active teachers. And then every once in a while, like this past spring, we do risk assessments. So those are sort of ad hoc every few years, and we say, what are the big things that are coming at our system? We can have some volatility in markets. We can have increases or decreases in mortality, where there could be some great treatment that increases lifespans that could be another thing. And one thing we looked at this particular time was what happens if there's a sustained decline in headcount in the teacher system, particularly given that we were starting to hear conversations about education transformation. We modeled a 2% decline per year for 5 years, so an ultimate 10% reduction. What we found is not a substantial impact on the funded percentage or on the amount we have to contribute annually as a state. However, that all depends, and that presumes that the head count is declining consistent with the average profile of the average teacher. Now, if it doesn't happen that way, for example, if there are retirement incentives that are encouraging late career teachers to retire early, that would impact different, that may have a negative impact. If there are rifts that might go the other way for lower. So I guess it's probably too long way of saying that we do, things may not have been taken into account at a certain time period, but because we have this cadence of annual and semi-annual studies that we look at, I think we're monitoring it actively, and we're looking things like the task force that I'm sure Jared talked about to make sure that our funding policies and others are going to take those kind of events, other things into consideration to fund for them adequately.
Thank you. I'm gonna close off this line of testimony now and really appreciate you answering that question. We took significant testimony on this last year. I can send around the links from that again, and if anyone wants to sort of refresh from there, we'll pick it back up, but I want to make sure we finish hearing about the bill.
Yes. So we have eagle-eyed viewers may have noticed that we skipped 2 sections because I figured those would be the ones that would be the meat of the questions. So we're saving the best for last here. And this is sections 2 and 3. 3 is really a sunset, so we'll set that aside for now. Section 2, this is a proposal that it is a funding adjustment to support the VT Saves program as it scales towards self-sufficiency. And the Vermont Saves program, as you may remember, is a program that allows folks who do not otherwise have access to a retirement savings option to enroll in that retirement savings option. And it does operate under an opt-out principle. So if you don't have this, your your firm is supposed to join it. You may choose to exit if you would like, but it does provide this opportunity. It's been operational for 1 year, just about. In that year, it's gone from 0 assets under management, 0 employees enrolled, to about 5,500 employees enrolled and a bit over 5 million in assets under management. So in just a year, we have seen a significant growth in this, and we do project that over the next several years, the growth in the number of accounts and the size of the assets under management will lead this program to be self-sustaining by 2033. In the meantime, there needs to be a mechanism to sustain it. That is what this fund, or this transfer rather, proposes to do. Currently, the unclaimed property, actually, I have a few slides, if it might be helpful to,
I think I want
if you want to just keep flying through.
sure that we get to Cam, who has.
Great. And Chris also has some of our slides are taken from his stuff, so he will give you the full overview here. But so that is the projection that the treasurer worked out, and I'm happy to share with the committee the results showing the assumptions behind that increase in revenue over the next several years. Currently, there is an unclaimed property transfer that goes from unclaimed property to the Higher Education Trust Fund. The transfer happens currently such that all the unclaimed property that is worth less than $100 and is more than 10 years old gets swept into that transfer. The most recent transfer, which is the largest one there ever was, is about $147,000. Just for comparison's sake, the total size of the Higher Ed Trust Fund right now is about $67.5 million. So it's a really extremely small portion of that fund. What this proposal proposes is to raise the threshold from $100 to $150. So now all the unclaimed property that is more than 10 years old and is under $150 will be swept in.
And for folks who are feeling eagle-eyed about our own jurisdiction, the 2 reasons this bill is with us is that unclaimed property is escheated to the state, and that makes it then our jurisdiction, and pension stuff is sort of peripherally connected to us via the Ed Fund. So back to you.
Here we are.
Yes.
So that will raise the amount eligible to be swept in. We are proposing a $300,000 cap on those sweeps, because if we didn't, there would the initial year, because everything older than 10 years would be, and over 150 would now be eligible. All of a sudden you have many years at once coming into eligibility's potential. So you have a potential, it's about $2.87 million that would be eligible. But we're proposing this $300 cap to sort of smooth this transition. And the key piece here is that up to $300,000 would now be eligible first to go to the Vermont Retirement Security Fund, which is the fund that supports the Vermont Saves system. The concept is that we would use only as much as is needed to support the Vermont Saves program. As revenues rise into the Vermont Saves program, only the amount necessary to meet the budget would be taken from that 300,000. The remainder of the 300,000 would be returned to the higher ed trust fund as it happens now. Again, Chris has the charts and data on this and fiscal notes, so we can talk to you a bit more about this, but our projections do show that by FY 29, we would see more coming into the higher ed trust fund than you do currently. So there would be a bit of a dip for a couple of years, then it would start rising up. FY 33 and on to the sunset, we project the full 300,000 transferring directly to the higher ed trust fund. So over the lifetime of this proposal, you would almost certainly see a greater amount going into the higher ed trust fund than you would under current law. So the higher ed trust fund, we believe, is held harmless over the duration of this, and not only held harmless, but is advantaged. But there is this transfer that allows BT Saves to be funded as it is rising towards self-sustainability.
Does this place any more burden on the employer?
I'm sorry, what was
Does
that?
this place any more burden on the employer?
This provision will not make any change for the employer. The employer employers, everybody people with 2 employees and above are required to sign up. We've worked hard to make that as simple and seamless as possible for employers. And this provision, though, would purely be a function behind the scenes that the employer would not ever have to think about or deal with.
Okay, because I heard from an employer in my district that was not happy and didn't think it was simple and seamless.
If you can put us in touch with them, we would be happy to make it as simple and seamless as possible.
Representative Muslim, do you still?
Yeah, you may have partially answered my questions, but when you were talking about the cap, I guess I'll call them policy suggestions as why you would have a cap like that. And does it have more to do with the higher ed trust fund or just general purposes on benefits and that sort of stuff?
You mean the cap of 300,000?
Yeah, sorry.
I think the general idea there is to make this transition smoother and more seamless. And if we were to have no cap in the first year, there'd be a sweep of 2.87 million.
Yeah.
With the cap, that money that doesn't get transferred stays eligible, and it helps to guarantee that over the lifetime of this proposal, we will almost certainly, I can't quite say certainly, but almost certainly reach that $300,000 cap every year, because that eligible money is still there. And so it kind of smooths the transition and then nearly guarantees that the $300,000 cap will be hit throughout the life.
Helpful. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm gonna have a shift taking us through the language of the bill, if you all can hang out for a few
Absolutely.
questions.
Yes, thank you.
Madam Chair, phone call.
Okay, we're gonna wrap at somewhere between 4:15 and 4:20.
Gotcha.
And in some like magic universe, we're gonna vote on this today, but it might be first thing tomorrow morning when we arrive.
Good afternoon. For the record, Cameron Wood, Office of Legislative Counsel, as I'm plugging in my laptop, which died 30 seconds ago.
Oh.
So forgive me while it boots back up. I'm going to speak about the bill. And I'm not going to walk through each section line by line. It's 36 pages. A lot of it is just administrative, deleting language here and moving it somewhere else, word for word, verbatim. But very quickly, as was mentioned, if you look at the first few sections, it's about unclaimed properties. And I think the treasurer's office mentioned all of the substantive changes that are being made here. If you look at the section 1, it's adding some language where when individuals are providing them with unclaimed properties, it's adding some language in under line 20 here to require some sort of explanation of the benefits that are coming through. So it's not just a number that's coming through on the form that the individual fills out when they submit the unclaimed property to the treasurer's office. And then when you look Section 2 and 3, I'm going to skip and come back to just as the treasurer's office did, because it's about where certain unclaimed property funds go. Come back to that. When you get to page 4, looking at section 4, and then page 5, looking at section 5, these are some more technical amendments that are being proposed to up thresholds, as the treasurer's office mentioned. If you look at section 4, the claimant has to verify. So this is the individual who's asking to receive the unclaimed property. The individual has to verify its completeness and accuracy. Looking at the top of page 5 there in the sub 3, unless the property has a value of less than $250, and then the claimant doesn't have to go through these hoops or go through these steps to get access. So this would be upping that threshold to 1,000. So anything less than 1,000, you don't have to kind of go through the extra steps to access those funds. And Sorcia, if you will let me interview, get a chance. And I can bring us up to where we are. Similarly, on section 5, which is on page 5, this is for how unclaimed property gets distributed when there's an estate, and there's kind of certain thresholds where if it's under a certain dollar amount, then it gets distributed either in accordance with the estate agreement or in accordance with state law, et cetera. So it's kind of just upping those thresholds from 5,000 to 10,000 about, in these circumstances, here's how we're going to deal with distributing the money, instead of requiring people to open an estate back up, for example. So one second. Okay. We are on to page 6. Okay, that's the unclaimed property section. So again, I'm going to come back to where the money gets distributed in just a second at the end. We're moving into section 6, which is on page 6, dealing with the Vermont State Retirement Systems. So the first piece here, moving to the top of page 7, this is for municipalities that participate in the state retirement system. This language is being added that if the payments are not received within 30 days after their due date, it gives the board the authority to assess interest. The only thing I highlight for you all, and I highlighted for the Government Operations Committee, is this does allow the board to assess interest and penalties on a political subdivision in the state. Outside of that, I understand the reasoning behind it because there isn't one currently. So municipal employers can be late. And as was mentioned, the recourses of the retirement system at this point are limited in what they do to address that. So moving to section 7, this is the pension and benefits funding task force that was mentioned. So it creates a task force. You have all your standard boilerplate language here. You have the members of the task force, the chair of both the House and Senate Appropriations Committee, Secretary of Administration, State
I'm gonna ask a
Treasurer,
really
et cetera, et cetera.
about that to the treasurer's office. The choice of the appropriations chairs rather than the pension oversight committee chair and vice chair. Was that,
I think.
and I really don't have an opinion. I was just curious.
Yeah, I believe we were tracking the prior task force, larger task force, but I defer to Tim if there's. The thinking was because this is such a funding centric study, the appropriations chairs made sense because it's all written down to how.
About like that,
Sorry,
it's all about that gap in those final.
yes,
Okay.
yeah, like when we're gonna pay.
All right, thanks.
Overall.
I it was just a.
Okay, the things I'll highlight here, page 9, as were mentioned, this is what the study will look at: long-term sustainability of the pension and benefit plans, the total cost of funding the system, the things that were mentioned by the treasurer's office. And I will highlight, I believe it was mentioned, the task force, here, this is line 1314, shall not make recommendations on member benefits, contribution levels, or assumed rates. They have the assistance of the Pension Investment Commission, the State Treasurer, Joint Fiscal Office. We have the due date, December 15th, all the standard language that's in here. there is an appropriation of $75,000. And there does authorize per diem reimbursement for individuals who participate that are not otherwise paid. Okay, we get to section 8, and it is going to be section 8 all the way through section 22. So from this page, page 11, all the way through to page 34. All of the sections here are dealing with moving the oversight administrative responsibility of those other post-employment benefits for state employees and teachers over to VPIC and out of the secretary, the office of the state treasurer. So nothing in any of these pages is new language, it's deleting language and then moving it over. So for example, and I'll just get to one example and kind of walk through it with you. I'll move to page 15. Subsection C, the state treasurer shall be the custodian of the assets in the fund. So this is the state employees' other post-employment benefit fund. The state treasurer is the custodian. It's moving that over to VPIC. And then you have similarly where the members of the commission, these are kind of standards of conduct for board members of the retirement system and members of the Vermont Pension Investment Commission. They can't have any direct interest in the gains or profits of the investments, etc. So that is being struck here in this section, but then it is simply being added over here in page 20. Under policies and limitations of Vermont Pension Investment Commission, except as otherwise provided, no member and no employee of the commission shall have any direct interest in the gains or profits of any investment made by the commission. So again, all of these things are just removing the standard language associated with the investment of these funds and moving them over to VPIC, consolidating their authority over not only the retirement system itself, but over the other post-employment benefits for state employees and teachers. Which is going to bring me all the way to the next section. Which is going to be on page 31. Apologies for the scroll. Dealing with pension credits, and as was mentioned, this is for the teachers in the municipal system. So if an individual member becomes the president of one of these organizations here, it authorizes those individuals to receive service credit for the period in which they're serving as the president, as long as those funds are being paid in by the employer. So it's just similar language that's just being added into those two sections.
Paid in by the employer or the employee?
Employer. So it would be the entity B itself, not the employee. So, I'm going to make sure, yes.
So this is only for the employee of the retirement board?
This is for, to get to the right page, so I get to the right language. So here. So a member who's elected to serve as the president of the employee organization designated as the exclusive bargaining representative for employees in this chapter. So I'm not as familiar with these entities as the treasurer's office. They may be able to more quickly answer your question than I can.
I don't quite understand what everyone's question is.
Well, this is teachers retirement. So when a teacher switches to administrator, a principal,
That's not what this
it
is.
doesn't go to their retirement, but that's not this.
Correct. This is an individual serving as the president of the exclusive.
The union, basically.
Okay.
Wait, will you finish that sentence or can you finish that sentence? I was glad that you jumped in. Sorry, Representative Burkhardt, I just.
Defer to Tim.
It's official testimony, yes.
Yeah, this would be, a president of the NEA is released from teaching duties, so they're not, in service. This would allow them to purchase service. And because the president of like the NEA could be either in the teachers or the municipal system, that's why it's in both of those sections.
Okay, moving to the last few pieces here is related to capital debt. As was mentioned, you have this capital debt affordability advisory committee. This committee issued a report recently and they wanted to make some slight tweaks to the language here. So the key words are going to be here on lines 6 and 7 of page 35 and developing. So for this Capital Debt Advisory Committee and developing its annual estimate and preparing its annual report, the committee has to consider a long list of items, including that is the criteria, this is in the sub 4, the criteria that recognized bond agencies use to judge the quality and of issues of state bonds, including, and then the change is down here in the sub D, other metrics and taking away the committee's discretion here, limiting it to other metrics adopted by recognized bond agencies, which is more of a limiting of what the advisory committee can look at, just for awareness. And then there's a similar change on the next page. The committee in its report needs to look at capital asset depreciation ratio, reflecting unfunded capital maintenance costs, and that's being changed to measures reflecting the remaining useful life of state infrastructure and the potential future capital maintenance and replacement costs. I don't really think there's a lot of substantive change to what's going on in this committee. It's more, my understanding is aligning the language as it was proposed to be amended by the committee. I believe it was at the beginning of last year. And then there's the positions, and then we have effective dates. The task force would go into effect on passage so they can begin their work immediately. The task force that comes back with the report on the pensions. And then there is a sunset. Okay, so I'm going to go all the way back to section 2. And I know I'm moving quickly. I apologize. I have to leave you all a little earlier. Okay, so we're back in the unclaimed properties section here. This is section 2 all the way back on page 3. Okay, so we have a lot of money coming in each year from unclaimed properties. The treasurer's office is required to maintain a certain amount of unclaimed property funds in order to make sure they're paying out unclaimed property claims that come in. So they have to keep enough cash on hand essentially to be able to make those payments. And then some of the money is then transferred over to the general fund every year. They don't keep all the unclaimed property that comes in. They understand that not all unclaimed property is going to be claimed. So they do provide certain transfer to the general fund every year. So before making that deposit, they may deduct certain things. They can deduct their expenses, the cost of publications and mailings, kind of standard things you would expect for administrative costs. And then the key piece is this subdivision 5 here. Property valued at $100 or less more than 10 years after the property was received. So 10 years later, no one has claimed it. It's a pretty good assumption that someone's not going to claim it. And so we want to make sure we're utilizing those funds for the best interest of the state. And so those funds can be transferred currently to the Higher Education Endowment Trust Fund. This is the language here on 17 and 18. There is no cap on how much money gets transferred over. Every year, if the property meets this criteria, it's less than $100 and it's more than 10 years old, we take those monies and we transfer it over here to the Higher Education Endowment Trust Fund. As the bill was introduced, that is raised to 150, the cap, $100 cap to 150, still has to be 10 years old. And then there's this provision that the money would go to the Vermont Retirement Security Fund, which is the administrative fund for Vermont Saves, with a $300,000 cap. Any remaining funds after that $300,000 cap would go to the Vermont Higher Education Endowment Trust Fund. Okay, my understanding is that's not the intention of what the treasurer's office is hoping to accomplish. So there is an amendment here to review. And I'm just going to look at the 5 here. It's a little broken up, but what this would do is it says we're still raising the cap to 150. So this first year, there's going to be a significant amount of money that's going to come in, over your standard year because you're raising that dollar threshold. So they're going to go all the way back to everything that's greater than 10 years and raise that cap up to 150. The sub A here and B are what you need to focus on. The administrator shall deposit the funds into the Vermont Retirement Security Fund created. So shall deposit those monies into the Vermont Saves admin account up to a cap of $300,000. Notwithstanding that, the administrator may, in the administrator's sole discretion, I'm on lines 8 moving down now, may deposit funds into the Vermont Higher Education Endowment Trust Fund, provided that not more than a combined total of $300,000 shall be deposited into both of those funds in any given year. So what does that mean? The treasurer, in the treasurer's sole discretion, is going to be able to determine how much of this $300,000 each year to deposit into which of those 2 trust funds. Could be 300,000 going all to Vermont Saves and nothing going to the Higher Education Endowment Trust Fund. Could be 150 and 150, as the treasurer's office mentioned. I think their goal, as has been stated, is to continue to support the sustainability of the Vermont Saves program. And then over time, the deposits into the Vermont Saves admin would start to come back down, and the deposits going back to the Higher Education Endowment Trust Fund would start to go up. But either way, it's capped at $300,000. I will highlight for you all, the treasurer's office will maintain the rest of the funds that they will get in this first swoop of these unclaimed property dollars. They will maintain them because it's not directed to go anywhere. But what I mean by that is when you go back to the beginning, it says before depositing anything into the general fund, the administrator may deduct these things. So they're not depositing this money into the general fund. You're increasing that cap from 100 to 150. So they're going to go back beyond 10 years. Everything that currently was 100 has been distributed, but not 150. So we're going way back, taking a lot of property, pulling it all in at once. What are you doing with it? It's then capped. The distribution of those dollars is capped at only $300,000 annually. So if the first initial swoop is over $2 million, you're capping the distribution at $300,000. What's remaining with the rest of the funds, the treasurer's office would be presumably maintaining those dollars and then distributing each year thereafter up to $300,000 until the funds have been distributed. Okay.
The maximum hit on the general fund is $300,000.
Technically,
Chris will answer
Yeah.
those questions.
Yeah.
Yep.
and then there's a sunset. This is repealed. I believe it's in 2039, December 31st, 2039. Yes, so it would be repealed January 1, 2040, in which case all of the money every year would go back to the Vermont Higher Education Endowment Trust Fund, and there would not be a cap. So you can see here, kind of deleting all of the new language that was added. And actually, this does keep the cap at $300,000. So. Okay. My apologies for the rush.
I was the one who put you after the other ones, so please don't be.
You asked if I wanted to go first, and I deferred to you. So, yes.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And I think we can ask if most of our questions. Anyone have any technical questions for Cam? Because I think we need to, great. Okay, thanks. You. Chris, and then we can have any final questions for the treasurer.
Well, hello, everyone. Chris Root from the Joint Fiscal Office. While I am waiting to get into the Zoom room, I will mention that Sorsha kindly posted a draft fiscal note under my name on the committee page, and I'll walk through that briefly. This is kind of awkward because
I asked, oh, that's not the part that's awkward. Is that the part that's awkward? I asked Chris to draft the fiscal notice if we approve the amendment, and if we don't approve the amendment, he'll revise it.
Yes.
My audio.
Is that better? Sweet. All right. Okay, so yeah, that blank will get filled in with an updated link once you all decide what to do, but it didn't make a whole lot of sense to sort of draft the fiscal note as introduced when you kind of know that there could be a technical change happening. So this speaks to the bill with the technical change included. So anytime we look at a bill like this, we don't go section by section in a fiscal note if the sections don't have fiscal impact. So this really focuses on just the sections that are material to fiscal things. Some of this is more of an appropriations committee jurisdiction, but there are a few things here that I wanted to draw your attention to. So the very first section here about the unclaimed property revenues, as you heard from the treasurer's office, the proposal is to increase that threshold on the small dollar over 10-year-old unclaimed property from $100 to $150. The impact of doing that would bring in about $2.87 million of additional unclaimed property from raising that threshold up. And as was noted, the amendment proposes putting a cap on the transfers at $300,000 a year to both sources combined. So right now, at the $100 level, this money goes to the higher ed trust fund, not the general fund. And it's not a huge source of revenue to the higher ed trust fund. When we were talking about the estate tax a few days ago, you all remember that the higher ed trust fund received like 26 million bucks this past year. There was like $60 million of accumulated contributions in the higher ed trust fund. So unclaimed property is a really, really small revenue source to this fund. Vermont Saves, those of you who have been around for a little bit will remember that when it was created, it was funded with a one-time appropriation of $750,000. That was intended to sustain the program as it got its legs under and started scaling up. At some point, it will scale up, with the intent of being fiscally self-sufficient from program fee revenue. Once you have more accounts open, more participants, more assets under management. These projections that I was delighted to see the treasurer's office use because I use their data in making them. So this truly is a consensus team effort. But figure one will show you that based on the treasurer's office projections of Vermont Saves' budget in the future, they expect that by fiscal 33, the program would be able to sustain itself on program revenue and not need the unclaimed property revenue. So this is intended to be sort of a bridge to keep Vermont Saves going as it continues to head toward fiscal self-sufficiency. Figure two then shows you with that $300,000 cap, what would that look like over time? And you would see that, by 2033, that full 300,000 would be available to go to the higher ed trust fund if the Vermont Saves program didn't need it. Here's just a little bit of history in table one that I thought was interesting. This goes back and shows how unclaimed property how much it's contributed to the higher ed trust fund in the last few years. And you'll see that it's been growing over time, but the 147,000 that it received in fiscal 25 was the highest amount it had received. And if that threshold were $150 instead of $100,
it would have brought in, over $300,000 a year. So based on the fact that more unclaimed property keeps coming into the system, there will always be, in addition to this, $2.8 million that would be sort of swept in initially under that higher threshold, there's always going to be new unclaimed property aging in to this, hitting the 10-year mark. So it is fully likely that under this change, due to those trends in the higher threshold, that the higher ed trust fund would be receiving more money in the future than it would be under status quo.
I knew we would talk about the higher ed trust fund so much this year.
Not me.
I mean, I think we all knew in the fall that we would be talking about it so much this year. Anyway, continue, sorry.
I'll just touch on this briefly. This is, I don't know about you, but this was the section I got the most excited about, was the Pension and Benefits Funding Task Force. I think you all care about this because teacher retirement systems are, funded in part by the Ed Fund. But as was mentioned, when the Treasurer's Office was here, at some point we as the legislature need to figure out what to do about unfunded liabilities after 2038, because that's the target date in statute right now that all of our funding points to. But as you start getting closer to that date, the risk of really wacky things happening in your contribution requirements can go up. And the simple example I think of is if we had a really, really bad investment year in 2033 and the market tanked that year, there's a 2-year lag built in. So what happens in 2033 informs the ADAC payment beginning in 2035. So you really only have like 4 years to spread up that impact across between 2035 and 2038. So as you get closer to that target date, the risk of the contributions doing something really unmanageable as a result of something that happens goes up quite a bit. Even if everything worked perfectly between now and 2038, we still need to have a conversation about what does life look like after 2038, because pension funds don't stay at 100% perfectly all the time. Like reality happens, there's timing issues. So, assumptions change sometimes. Like we don't hit all of our assumptions spot on every single year. So there's variability, there's risk, it's part of it. It's a really good time to have this conversation when we've got sort of for lack of a better word, a blue sky rather than a massive economic crisis that is forcing different fiscal considerations. So if we were trying to close a $300 million budget deficit, that might not be a great time to have this conversation because it might be guided by different objectives than thinking about what makes sense for the long term for the state. So there is a $75,000 appropriation in this bill to fund this task force, and that would fund actuarial work. And it's sort of a skinny down version of the big pension task force that happened in the summer of 2021, which really excited me to work on. So the other thing I really wanted to mention to you all about, the sections 8 through 20 dealing with OPEB. This is not a new issue. We haven't talked about it very much in this committee, but a few years back, I think it was in the big bill, the Treasurer's Office was given some money to do a governance study on OPEB to see, the sole fiduciary model currently in place made more sense at a different time when there were fewer assets under management and we are on a pay-go basis. This was invested in the trust investment account. Really doesn't make a lot of sense to invest in the trust investment account for refunding OPEB because it's very heavily weighted toward protecting your principal. So it's more invested in fixed income than you would probably put the rest of your pension funds in. There's now hundreds of millions of dollars in these systems. It's going to be a growing balance over time. I think the two OPEB systems earned like $36 million just in investment income in the last year. So they're growing quickly. The report that came out a few years ago had identified transitioning OPEB over to VPIC as sort of the sole main recommendation. And these 12 sections of language accomplish that. There will be, and again, this is more of a appropriations thing, but I just want to make you aware of that as part of this, there will be some budgetary shifts of costs from the treasurer's budget over to VPIC. some of this VPIC did request and they identified a need for an additional position. There's currently 4 people at VPIC. They identified a need for another position that is not included in this bill. I did flag it in the fiscal note as an identified need. Should the Appropriations Committee agree to create that position or to go along with all of this, the costs of that would be borne proportionately from the retirement funds. These are not general fund asks. So, and you'd also see some movements from the treasurer's budget over to VPIC for things like the professional service contracts that they currently manage for OPEB. I think everybody described the retirement credits for the president of an employee organization really well. I've mentioned this in here just in case people ask what this was about, but it doesn't have an expected fiscal impact because it would be done on an actuarially equivalent basis. And then, yeah, there were requests for 3 positions, 2 in unclaimed property, 1 on the retirement division. These are in the bill. The VPIC position I mentioned is not in the bill. I don't know if there's anything else you want to talk about, because I sort of glossed through 6 pages pretty quickly, but.
Does anyone have any questions for Chris?
Is there any other place where the treasurer or another officer so authorized has the ability to decide which fund gets the money?
I don't know. I'd have to ask some of my colleagues.
New to me.
Anyone else have a question for Chris?
I do not for Chris, I do have from the treasurer.
Oh, yes, okay. Anything else for Chris? Thank you, Chris.
You.
Some combination of the treasurer's office, like to sit back in the chair again. Thank you, David.
I think it's a very quick question, actually, and I'm just wondering, and I know we're dwelling on smaller part of this more than the bigger part that Chris really focused on. But with Vermont Higher Education Endowment Trust Fund, is the governor still asking to also shift away the other source of revenue for that fund? And because that was in the proposed budget that we saw before, that he's proposing to take away the revenue stream that sort of has a windfall every few years, which is what happened last year. He's proposing to shift that someplace else, and he's proposing to take $15 million out of it right now for another purpose as well. Do you know if that is still on the table? Because it just sort of feels like all 3 of these things are kind of happening to that little fund all at the same time. And so I was just wondering if you knew any more about those other plans for the fund.
I can't speak with certainty to what the governor's current assessment of those things are. I do know that you are correct that both of those things were proposed in the governor's budget. With respect to our proposal, I can add that we did have agreement from the 3 higher ed trust fund beneficiaries as of the fall when we went to them to ask about this, and they were all in agreement with this. And we explained the fiscal impact as Chris did, and we did briefly as well, that at least our piece of this would ultimately end up have the effect of transferring more money into the higher ed trust fund, and they were in agreement with this.
That's helpful information. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Folks, we're gonna wrap up and vote tomorrow either at 9 a.m. or at 10:50. So let me know if you need something before that happens. And it'll be the amendments that are sort of technical changes to meet the intent of the bill that came over from GovOps. It'll be 2 votes. See you tomorrow at 9.